Who fed my horse?" The voice came out of the dark like gravel dragged across dry wood. Caleb Rourke stepped through the cellar door of the Castaño Inn stable before the sun had cleared the rooftops, and the first thing he saw was the woman. Small, 30-some years, a wooden bucket in both hands, the steam off the oats catching the thin orange light that leaked through the slat in the wall above her. The mare, his mare, was eating from it already, her big jaw working in slow, satisfied circles. He stood there for a moment without moving. The smell of the place was something he knew the way a man knows an old wound. Wet straw, horse sweat, the sweetness of grain gone a little damp, and underneath all of it, the salt coming off the bay 2 blocks east. The light through the slat hit the left side of the woman's face and left the right in shadow. She did not flinch when she heard him. She did not step back. She turned slowly, as if she had known he was there before he opened the door, and looked at him with the particular stillness of someone who has learned not to move fast around men with guns. Rourke had a scar along his left jaw, a thin white crescent he'd carried since the Rio Pecos in 1873, when a Comanche knife had found the only inch of him the leather collar didn't cover. That scar went tight when he was angry. It was tight now. "I asked you a question," he said. "September 1874. 7 years before that morning, a ship called the Celestial Crown had come into the harbor at Corpus Christi with its hull low in the water and 211 souls packed into a space built for 100. The docks smelled of fish 3 days dead, of tar and salt, and the particular sweetness of wood that has been wet too long. The Gulf pressed hard against the pilings. A line of people moved along the gangway in the September heat, shirts stuck to backs, children crying in a language the dock hands didn't recognize, the whole procession shuffling forward under a sky the color of hammered copper. Mei Lin Yuen was 28 years old. She carried a canvas bag over her left shoulder and a leather suitcase in her right hand, the handle worn smooth at the grip. Her husband walked half a step ahead. He was a careful man. She had always known this about him and had married him anyway because careful men survived. She was almost to the customs gate when the guard stepped out. He was a big man, pale in the way of men who burn in the sun and never tan, with a mustache that sat on his face like something he'd found on the ground. He didn't look at her husband. He looked at Mei Lin, and then he put one hand flat against her chest and pushed. She stumbled back into the person behind her. "Get back to China," he said, not loud. The worst things rarely are. She felt her husband's hand on her elbow, steadying her, pulling her a half step to the right so the line could move. She looked at him. He was watching the guard, reading something in the man's posture, calculating. He had the money for their passage. He had a letter of invitation from a cousin in Galveston. He had everything they needed to get through that gate and into this country, and none of it would survive a scene. She understood. She straightened. She picked up the suitcase. It had fallen when she stumbled, and she gripped the handle, and she did not say a word. She learned something that afternoon, standing in the wet September heat of Corpus Christi with a stranger's hand still on her breastbone in memory. She learned that in this country, existing cost more than she had, and that the only currency she had left was silence. 7 years later, the same hands that had held that suitcase were holding a bucket of oats, and they were about to change the life of a man who didn't yet know he needed changing. September 1881. Caleb Rourke had been confined to the Castaño Inn for 11 days by order of the Nueces County Court, and in that time he had learned the particular texture of waiting, the way a morning can feel like a sentence before anyone reads it out loud. 23 years in the Texas Rangers, he had ridden with 3 different battalion commanders and outlasted 2 of them. He had tracked men across 400 miles of desert and brought them back alive when the law required it and not when it didn't. He was the best marksman in Company D for 11 consecutive years, not because he was fast, but because in 23 years he had never once shot the wrong man, until the night of November the 14th, 1880. On a dock in Corpus Christi in the rain, when a man he didn't know stepped out of the shadow of a warehouse doorway and Rourke had fired before the thought was fully formed. The man had not been armed. That was what Roy Birch swore, before God and Judge Harmon Kloss and the entire county, that Caleb Rourke had shot an unarmed civilian in cold blood on the Corpus Christi waterfront, that the dead man, a laborer named Wong, had been carrying nothing but a lantern, that there was no reason, that the ranger had simply fired. The trial was in 2 days. His attorney had sent a letter 3 days ago. The letter explained, in the careful language of a man who had already decided what he was going to do, that a conflict of interest had made it impossible for him to continue the representation. Rourke had read the letter twice, and then set it down on the windowsill of his room and looked at the harbor. Deputy Marshal Cyrus Patton would read the formal charges tomorrow morning. The courtroom was 2 blocks from the inn. Rourke was not permitted to leave the premises without an escort, and the one deputy assigned to him had the particular quality of a man who understood, without being told, whose side he was expected to be on. 2 days to prove he didn't pull the trigger on purpose. 2 days to explain a split second of bad judgment in the dark and the rain to a county that had already made up its mind. He stood in the doorway of the stable with the scar tight on his jaw, looking at the woman with the bucket of oats, and something moved behind his eyes. Not quite anger, and not quite something else. "That's my mare," he said. "You don't come into this stable without permission. You don't touch my animal. You don't come near my gear." He took a step forward. The light shifted. The mare, unbothered by any of it, kept eating. "I'm going to report this to the deputy marshal," he said. "Trespassing on a guest's property. Interference with—" "She was crying," Mei Lin said. The words came out quiet, not soft. There's a difference. Soft is when a person is afraid and trying not to show it. Quiet is when a person has nothing to prove. "She was crying at midnight," Mei Lin said. "The sound came through the wall. I gave her oats. That's all." She looked at him without looking away. He looked at her. Then she turned, set the bucket down against the wall, and walked out of the stable and back toward the door that led to the inn's rear courtyard. No hurry, no apology, no fear that he could name, but not fear. Rourke stood in the smell of wet straw and watched her go, and something in the back of his mind registered what his pride refused to. She had walked away from him the way a person walks away from a calculation they've already finished. He had 2 days to prove he didn't pull the trigger, and the only witness to anything, the only person in Corpus Christi who'd looked at him that morning without pity or contempt, was the woman he'd just threatened to report to the marshal. The letter from the court arrived before breakfast. 2 paragraphs. The first confirmed that Theodore Aldous had formally withdrawn from the case, citing personal conflicts of interest. The second informed Rourke that he would be permitted to present his own defense before Judge Claus, a right the letter described as a courtesy, in the language of men who had already decided courtesy was all he deserved. He set it on the windowsill next to the first one. He did not read it again. He had slept badly, 3 hours, maybe 4, with the bay coming through the shutters, the water slapping the dock pilings in a slow, indifferent rhythm. By the time the light changed, he was already dressed, already moving, because a man waiting for something bad to happen can either sit still and let it arrive or walk toward it and at least choose the direction. He knew about the witness, had known since Patton mentioned her, careful and almost cheerful. Clara Fitch, a boarding house keeper from San Patricio Street, who claimed to have seen Rourke arguing with the laborer Wang on the waterfront before the shot. Rourke had never spoken to Wang in his life. He had sent word asking to meet her. Greer, the young deputy assigned to him, the one who blinked too often, had come back that afternoon looking at the floor. Clara Fitch had left Corpus Christi for San Antonio. Family matter. No forwarding address. That was the day before. Now there was no attorney and no witness, and the trial was in 2 days, and Rourke stood at the window watching Water Street and doing arithmetic. What he had was the truth, which in 23 years of rangering he had learned was the least reliable currency in a county courthouse. What he had was the knowledge that Roy Birch was lying, which proved nothing. He needed someone who had been on Water Street that November night and was still in Corpus Christi and still willing to say so out loud. There was a tailor's shop 2 doors from where Wang had died. He knew because he had walked the dock on his own 11 days ago, before the confinement order. A narrow storefront with a painted sign, Chan and Son Tailoring, alterations and fine work. The lamp in the window had been lit even in the middle of the afternoon. Greer walked him down Water Street at 10 in the morning, one hand loose near the holster he never touched. The September air was already heavy, a damp heat off the bay that carried salt and pitch and whatever the tide had brought in and declined to take back. The sun, not yet high enough to flatten the shadows between the warehouses. The man behind the tailor's counter was old, with a face that had stopped being surprised by what walked through a door. He was hemming trousers when Rourke pushed in, and he did not look up right away. "Mr. Chan," Rourke said. "Mr. Chan is dead. I'm Mr. Liu. What do you need?" Rourke laid both hands flat on the counter. "I need someone who was on Water Street on the 14th of November, past midnight, near the Fitch warehouse." The needle paused, then resumed. "The Chinese woman down the street," Liu said. "The seamstress. She keeps her light on past midnight, most nights." He took his time selecting a new spool of thread. "Woman like that sees things. Whether she'll tell you is another matter." "Name?" "Mei Lin, 3rd door past the chandler's, the one with the curtain." Liu looked at the trousers instead of at him. "She doesn't like being bothered during the day, I'll tell you that for nothing." He stood in front of the 3rd door past the chandler's for a moment before he knocked. The curtain was cream-colored muslin, pulled shut, but the light behind it said someone was there. Underneath the salt and tar of the street came something else. Beeswax, maybe, and the dry smell of cloth that has been pressed and folded 10,000 times. He knocked. A pause, not the pause of someone who hadn't heard. The door opened. Mei Lin looked at him with the same stillness she'd had in the stable. Not fear, not surprise. The stillness of a person who reads a room before walking into it. She wore a dark work apron over a gray dress, a length of thread looped around her wrist, a small pair of scissors at her belt. The shop behind her was narrow and close, a long work table, bolts of fabric stacked against one wall, 2 oil lamps burning, the smell of beeswax and pressed cotton. "You?" she said. A notation, not an accusation. "Me." He kept his hat in his hands. "I'm not here to apologize." He heard how that sounded and kept going. "My lawyer quit. The woman who was supposed to testify left town. I need someone who was on this street on the night of November the 14th, near the Fitch warehouse, past midnight. I have 2 days." "I know how many days you have," Mei Lin said. He registered that, did not pursue it. "Were you here that night?" "I'm here every night," she said. "Did you see anything near the warehouse?" "A man at the alley. Someone who was not unarmed." She looked at him. Not the way a person looks when they're thinking of an answer, the way a person looks when they already have the answer and are deciding whether the question deserves it. "What exactly do you want me to testify to?" she said. "That Roy Birch is lying." Silence. 3 seconds. "Come back tomorrow night," she said. Tomorrow night doesn't leave much time before tomorrow night. She closed the door, not hard, just closed. Rourke stood on the sidewalk with the Gulf air coming off the water and the gulls working the line somewhere behind him. He put his hat back on. Greer waited at the end of the block, looking at the middle distance. He had come for a yes. He had gotten 3 words, carefully chosen, and something in the care of them told him there was more behind that curtain than a seamstress who worked late. She had looked at him the way people look at men who are already dead, but there was something else in her eyes, like she was deciding whether he deserved to know the truth. He came back the next night as she'd told him to. Water Street was quiet by 9 o'clock. The laborers gone, the chandlers shuttered, the only sound the distant knock of boat hulls against the dock pilings and the occasional call of something out over the bay. The air had cooled maybe 2 degrees from the afternoon and smelled of salt and low tide and the tar someone had been laying on the warehouse roof 2 doors down. Rourke walked it without Greer. He'd told the deputy he needed the privy and took the long way around. The light behind the cream curtain was on. He knocked twice. The same pause as before, the pause of someone who already knew the shape of the knock before it finished. The door opened. She had a candle in her hand, one of the small tallow ones that burned low and steady. The shop smelled of beeswax and cotton and something faintly herbal he couldn't name, and the lamplight threw the whole narrow room in amber. A needle rested on its side in the pincushion on the work table. A half-sewn panel of dark wool lay flat beside it. She had been working when he knocked. She stepped back and let him in without a word. He took off his hat. She set the candle on the table and sat down on the low stool beside the work table. She did not offer him the chair across from her. He took it anyway because there was nowhere else to stand that wasn't in her way, and because some habits of 23 years don't stop just because a man has lost the badge that made them official. For a moment, neither of them said anything. The candle threw soft shadows up the bolts of fabric stacked against the wall. Outside, something far out on the water made a low sound, a bell or a buoy, or just the Gulf deciding to speak. "The 14th of November," she said. "You were on Water Street?" "On my rounds, yes." "What time did you reach the Fitch warehouse?" 11:30, maybe 11:45. "How did you enter the block?" He looked at her. The question was too precise for a witness. Witnesses described what they saw. They didn't ask what you did. "From the south end," he said, "off Mesquite." "And the warehouse? Was the side door open or shut when you passed it the first time?" "The first time." She already knew there had been more than one pass. "Shut," he said. "Padlocked. I checked it." "And the second time?" "The door was ajar. I saw light inside. That's when I drew." He stopped. "Why do you know there was a second time?" She reached across the table and moved the pincushion a half-inch to the left. Not because it was in the way, because her hands needed something to do. "How many men were in the alley between the warehouse and my shop?" she said. He was quiet for 2 seconds. "I saw one, Wang. He came out of the alley when I was almost to the door." "And you didn't see the second one?" The candle flame moved in a draft from somewhere. Rourke set both hands flat on his knees. "No," he said, "I didn't." She looked at him then. The full, steady look she'd given him twice before, the one that had nothing afraid in it. He realized, sitting in the amber light of her shop with the wool and the beeswax smell around him, and the Gulf tapping at the dark outside, that she had not once looked away from him during this conversation, that she was not looking at his scar, not at his hands, at his face. The way a person looks when they are trying to determine whether a man is lying or simply wrong, and have decided the distinction matters. "The man you're looking for," she said, "has a warehouse 2 doors from mine." He already knew which warehouse. He said it anyway, Fitch. "The meetings happen late, the last Tuesday of every month and sometimes more often." She picked up the needle from the pincushion and turned it between 2 fingers without looking at it. "The walls between his building and mine are not thick. I don't think he's ever thought about that." "You've heard them." "I hear things," she said. "People forget that walls are thin when they think no one important is on the other side." He held that a moment. There was a long history in that sentence, and it wasn't about walls. "What did you hear?" he said. "Enough." She set the needle back down. "Enough that I know Roy Birch was on that street before you were. Enough that I know what Wong was carrying wasn't a lantern." Something moved in his chest. Not relief, not yet. Something more careful than relief. The feeling of a man who has been told that the ground under his feet is solid and doesn't quite trust himself to believe it. "Why didn't you go to the deputy marshal?" he said. She looked at him for a long moment without answering. Then, "Would he have taken my statement? A Chinese woman alone against Edmund Fitch?" He had no honest answer for that. He didn't try to make one. She reached for the half-sewn panel of wool and spread it across her lap, and her hands went to the needle and thread in the way of someone who thinks better when their hands are moving. She did not look at him when she spoke next. "I've been here 7 years, she said. 7 years in this shop, on this street, in this city, making myself small enough that nobody would have reason to touch me." She pulled the thread through. 7 years since my husband died, and nobody sent word, and nobody came, and I sewed his burial cloth myself and buried him in the back of the yard because the church didn't want him in their ground. Another pull. 7 years, and I'm still here. Rourke watched her hands. He had uncrossed his arms somewhere in the middle of her talking and hadn't noticed until now. "Why did you stay?" he said. She didn't answer right away. The candle dripped once onto the table and she reached over and smoothed the wax without looking, because leaving would mean he won. She said it the way she said everything, quiet, without performance. But it was the first answer she'd given him that came out before she'd finished calculating it. He heard the difference. He thought she probably knew he heard it. He didn't ask who he was, not Edmund Fitch. The pronoun carried something older than Fitch. The guard on the dock in 1874, maybe, or the country itself, or something that has no name except the accumulated weight of 7 years of being looked through. Before this story ends, I want to ask you something, and I want you to sit with it. Have you ever held the truth in your hands and stayed quiet because you knew the world wasn't ready to believe you? Leave your answer down below. I'll be reading. He left her shop at 10:30. Greer was waiting in the inn's front hallway with the deliberate innocence of a man who had decided not to ask. Rourke went upstairs. He set his hat on the window ledge. He lay down on top of the covers in his boots the way he always did, always had since Mary died, since there was no reason to do it properly. He was asleep before the harbor bell rang 11. He did not wake at 3 in the morning. He did not wake at 2 or 4, or at the sound of the tide turning. He slept the dense, dark sleep of a man whose body had finally stopped bracing for the next thing. He would not have been able to say why. He would not have been able to name what was different about that night, in that room, in that city where the trial was still 20-some hours away and the odds were still running against him 3-1. But something in the space behind his sternum had loosened a fraction of an inch. It was the first night in 4 months that he'd slept it through. What she hadn't told him, what she hadn't told anyone, was that the truth he was looking for had been sleeping 6 inches under the floorboards of her shop for the past 5 months. She came to him. That was the thing he hadn't expected. He had been awake since before first light, sitting at the window with his boots on in the harbor gray below him, watching the fishing boats move out past the point in the dark. The trial was tomorrow. Not 2 days. Tomorrow. The deputy marshal had sent word the previous evening. A folded paper slipped under his door by Greer, who had knocked once and walked quickly away, as if he'd rather not be the man who delivered it. The date had been moved up. Judge Kloss had a circuit to ride on Thursday. The county would hear the case Wednesday morning at 9. Wednesday morning was 12 hours away. He had been calculating the same problem since midnight and finding the same 4 walls every time. He had the knowledge that Roy Birch was lying. He had 23 years of clean record. He had Mei Lin's words from the night before, the warehouse, the meetings, Birch on Water Street before he was. He had all of that. What he didn't have was a single thing a court would accept. The knock came at 6:30. 3 taps, quick, not loud. The kind of knock a person makes when they've already decided they're going in and are giving the courtesy of a second's warning. He opened the door. Mei Lin stood in the corridor with a canvas satchel over one shoulder, her dark dress unchanged from the night before. She glanced once down the hall toward the stairwell. "I need you to come with me," she said. "Where?" "The shop. Now, before Greer is awake." Water Street was still half dark, the morning coming in slow off the bay, the salt smell sharp and the air cool for September. Their footsteps on the wood plank sidewalk were the loudest thing on the street. She unlocked the shop door and held it for him, and he went in. The lamps were unlit. The light coming through the cream curtain was thin and gray, enough to see by if you waited for your eyes to settle. The work table, the bolts of fabric against the wall, the smell of beeswax and cotton. She set the satchel down and crossed to the far end of the counter, the part nearest the wall shared with the Fitch warehouse. She crouched down. Rourke watched. She pressed 2 fingers against the edge of a floorboard at the join between it and the one beside it. She pressed and then pulled. The board came up with a sound dry and precise, a single low crack, and then the grain of it lifting. Dust rose. The smell of earth and old wood came up from the gap. Darker, cooler, the smell of something that had not had air in a long time. She reached into the gap with both hands. When she straightened, she was holding a book. It was small. The cover was dark cloth, dyed so many times it had no single color left. Somewhere between brown and black, with a seam along the spine stitched in fine thread. The pages were thin, thinner than any paper he was used to, the kind that seemed like it would tear at the wrong pressure. And she handled it the way you handle something you've handled 10,000 times and never stopped being careful with. She set the board back in place. She carried the book to the work table. She still hadn't lit the lamp. He hadn't asked her to. She opened the book near the back, where the writing was dense and the pages had a different texture from being opened more recently. She turned pages slowly. He stood across the table and did not speak. She stopped. She looked at the page for a moment, then she looked at him. March the 14th, she said, 1881, 3 days before the shooting. She set one hand flat beside the writing, and she read, Birch, follow Wang to the dock tonight. Tuesday rounds. Rourke patrols Water Street South End, 11:30. If Rourke is on the block when Wang comes out of the alley, make sure the messenger falls with his bullet. Make it clean. After this, Rourke's the one who fired, not you. She stopped. The room was very quiet. The water moved against the dock pilings in its slow, indifferent way. It continues, she said. 2 more sentences. Read them. Wang knows too much. He would have talked eventually. This way, he doesn't talk, and the Ranger takes the fall. Fitch. She closed the book. She put both hands flat on the cover and looked at him. Rourke did not move. He stood at the work table across from her, both hands at his sides, and the sentence worked its way through him the way cold water works through a man who has been holding his breath, not fast, not loud, just present everywhere at once. Roy Birch had been on Water Street before he was. Wang had not stepped out of that alley by accident. He had been put there, walking to his own death without knowing it, and Rourke had not known it. And the only one who had known was Roy Birch, standing in the dark with a pistol already drawn and a story already decided. Rourke had heard the shot. He had believed for 5 months that it was his. He looked at his hands. He looked at the window. He looked at the thin gray light coming through the curtain, the dust moving in it. A door opening somewhere in the building, someone's mourning, nothing to do with this room or this book or the 5 months of carrying a man's death in his chest like a stone. He didn't say anything for a long time. Mei Lin didn't fill the silence. She waited with her hands on the book, her face in 3/4 light, watching him the way she always watched, reading what was there, not deciding ahead of time what to find. When he finally spoke, his voice came out lower than he meant it to. Why didn't you come forward?" She held his gaze without moving. Who would believe a Chinese widow against Edmund Fitch? He opened his mouth and closed it, because the answer was sitting in the room between them, cold and plain. The same answer that had kept that book in the dark for 5 months, kept her hands moving at 2 in the morning, while a man lay in a courthouse cell waiting for a trial already decided. The answer was nobody. Nobody in Corpus Christi in 1881 would have taken the word of a Chinese seamstress over Edmund Fitch, who had money and a reputation, and Roy Birch ready to swear to anything on a Bible. He had no response for that. He didn't make one. She picked up the book and held it out across the table. He took it. The cover was warmer than he expected. She had been carrying it close under the satchel flap the whole walk over. The pages inside were covered in 2 kinds of writing, lines of English in a tight, careful hand, and beside them, in columns down the right margin, characters he didn't recognize. She had written it twice, once for the record and once he understood without being told, so that it could not be dismissed as the word of a woman who didn't truly know the language she'd written it in. He held the book for a moment without reading. Outside, the morning was coming in fuller now, the gray turning toward white, the sound of the first business on the block pulling back a shutter. Corpus Christi waking up, the trial in 12 hours. He held the diary like it might dissolve. 2 days before his hanging, 1 day now, the only proof of his innocence was in the hands of a woman that the law of this country had already decided didn't count. They worked. That was the only word for it. They spread Mei Lin's papers on the work table, not the diary, which Rourke kept inside his vest, but the other things. A ledger page she had copied in her careful hand from fragments heard through the wall, a sketch of the warehouse layout drawn from memory, a list of dates and initials she'd been keeping since the previous spring. She had not known at the time what she was building. She had only known that Fitch moved through Corpus Christi like a man who believed records were for other people, and that the wall between his warehouse and her shop was thinner than he'd ever bothered to check. Rourke read everything she set down. He had to ask twice about her shorthand. "That mark," he said, pointing to a small dash beside a date. "Shipment came in at night, off the regular manifest." "How do you know?" "The loading noise was different, and the morning after, Fitch was at the courthouse buying drinks for the harbor master. He went back to reading. She picked up her work. The shop was closed. The morning light barely passed gray outside the curtain, but her hands thought better when they were moving. She found his jacket, the one he'd folded over the chair, and turned it over without quite deciding to. The lining on the left side had torn at the seam, the padding pushing through in a small ridge. She threaded a needle. He kept reading. The scratch of paper. The gulf out on the water, far enough away to be more texture than sound. She worked the lining closed, small close stitches, the kind that don't show, and set the jacket back on the chair. He noticed when he stood to reach for it, he ran 2 fingers along the seam. "You didn't have to do that. It was bothering me." She was already looking at the ledger page. He put the jacket on and sat back down without another word. It was a small thing. He knew it was a small thing, but he could not come up with a date, not a year, not a season, for the last time someone had repaired something of his without being asked, without wanting anything back. He let the thought go. She had mapped the whole port operation from fragments, the meetings through the wall, the names she'd overheard, the pattern of which ships arrived without appearing in the harbor master's morning log. She had not thought of herself as building a case. She had thought of herself as surviving. In 7 years on Water Street, the two had turned out to be the same thing. "The November shipment," he said. "Wang. Gold coin, unregistered, 3 buyers waiting." They knew my route. They knew your route for 6 months. I heard them say your name in March, in April, in May. She moved the sketch toward him and pointed to a mark near the north alley door. "Rourke wasn't a mistake. You were the plan." He was quiet. Outside, a cart ground down Water Street. Someone called to someone on the pier. The city was waking up around them without any idea what was happening in this small room that smelled of beeswax and pressed cloth. The ones who go unnoticed are the ones who see everything. By mid-morning, they had a full picture of the scheme, the buyers, the code names, the assessor from the county who appeared in her notes 3 times and whose name Rourke wrote carefully on a separate sheet. She heated water on the small iron stove and made tea, and he drank it without comment. The cup was ceramic, painted blue, the kind brought across an ocean in a canvas bag. At some point, she sat back from the table and said, without looking up, "Your wife. When did she die?" He looked at the wall. 76, typhoid fever. I was in the field when the letter came. A pause. "She used to bring feed to the mare," he said, "every morning. Her thing. She liked the routine of it." He turned a paper over without reading it. "That's why I was angry when I found your bucket in the stall. Someone had done that thing she used to do, and it caught me without warning." He set the paper down. That's all it was. She looked at him then, not her measuring look, something quieter than that. "She sounds careful," Mei Lin said. She was. They didn't speak for a while. The stove made a small sound. "My husband is buried in the back of the yard," she said, "under the fig tree. The church wouldn't take him." I didn't argue. She smoothed the ledger page with the back of her hand. "I sewed the burial cloth myself, white linen, 2 nights, and I put him in the ground. A man from the stable next door helped carry the box. He didn't say a word, but he came." A pause. "I still bring the fig tree water in the dry months." Rourke looked at her. She was not asking for anything. She had said it the way she said most things, because it was true, and because it was the hour for true things. He nodded once. She saw it, and he meant it. And that was the kind of exchange that doesn't need more words built on top of it. By mid-morning, Rourke had everything folded into his inside pocket alongside the diary. He stood to go. "I need you at the courthouse," he said. "Whatever the deputy marshal says." "I'll be there," she said. He reached for his hat. He stopped. "Mei Lin, 7 years of writing this down and keeping it safe. I want you to know I understand what that cost." She looked at him. "Cost me nothing," she said. "Cost him everything when this is finished." Edmund Fitch had a friend in the county clerk's office. Not a deep friendship, the kind bought over years with small favors and careful memory. That friend had been in the courthouse the previous afternoon and had heard the name of a new witness being added to the defense filing. That evening, Fitch sat in the back room of his office on Chaparral Street and listened. He did not raise his voice. He did not stand. He turned the glass of whiskey at his elbow once and set it back down. "Find out where it's coming from," he said to Roy Birch, who stood near the door with his hat in his hands, "and then fix it." Birch left without a word. By 10 o'clock, he was across the street from the seamstress's shop, standing in the shadow of the chandler's doorway, watching the light behind the cream curtain. Birch watched the light in the shop until 3 in the morning. When it finally went out, he crossed the street and lifted the loose board under the counter. The diary was gone. Edmund Fitch did not sleep. He sat in the back room of his Chaparral Street office until the clock pushed past 4 in the morning, and when Birch came back with his hat in his hands and nothing in his face, Fitch didn't need to be told. "She gave it to him," Birch said. "When?" "I don't know. The board was clean, no dust, no mark. She'd been putting it down careful every time." He turned the hat by the brim. "Could have been days ago." Fitch looked at the glass of whiskey at his elbow. He didn't pick it up. "Then we don't touch the diary," he said. "We touch her." By 6 in the morning, Deputy Marshal Cyrus Patton had a visitor. Fitch didn't come himself. He sent a man with an envelope, and the envelope was the kind that says more in its weight than its words. Patton read the single page inside, set it face down on the blotter, and sat for a moment looking at the wood grain. He had been in Nueces County for 11 years. He knew which way the current ran. He sent Greer to find Mei Lin Yuen. Rourke heard it from the woman who ran the inn's kitchen. He was in the downstairs hall pulling on his jacket when she came through with a basket of eggs and said it the way people say things they've decided aren't their business. Quickly, without looking up, a Chinese woman taken in on Water Street by the deputy? Something about the trial? He was out the door before she finished the sentence. The jailhouse was a low brick building on Mesquite, 1 block from the courthouse. Greer was on the front step and stepped aside without quite meaning to. Rourke went straight to Patton. "Where is she?" he said. "In custody. Preventive detention, pending tomorrow's proceeding." Patton's voice was flat. Not cruel, just that particular flatness that comes from a decision already made. "There's concern she may be in possession of evidence material to a federal matter." "She's a witness." "She's a person of interest in an obstruction inquiry as of this morning." A pause that had the shape of an apology without being one. "My hands aren't my own right now, Caleb." Rourke looked at him. Patton looked at the blotter. "I want to see her." The cell was at the back of the building. 3 walls of brick, 1 of iron bars, a high, narrow window, letting in a stripe of morning light that crossed the floor and stopped 2 feet short of the bench. She was sitting on the bench along the far wall, straight-backed, hands folded in her lap, one resting on the other the way they rested when she was waiting rather than working. Her apron was gone. The small scissors that usually hung at her belt were gone. Everything that might have been used as a tool had been taken. She looked up when she heard his boots on the brick floor. He stopped at the bars. He reached inside his jacket and closed his hand around the diary without taking it out. A reflex, checking that a thing was still there. It was there. He looked at her. She looked at him. She did not say anything. She did not lean forward or put her hands out. She sat on that bench in the morning light, and she looked at him the way you look at someone when you already know what they're carrying and have decided not to make it heavier. She did not ask. That was the whole thing, right there. 10 seconds of silence that weighed more than anything Patton had said. She had looked at him and made a calculation and decided the choice was his to make. She had given him the book. She would not ask for it back. He turned and walked back down the hall. He tried once more. Patton was at his desk. Rourke laid both hands on the edge of it. "I'll give you the diary, right now, in exchange for her release." Patton looked at the hands, then at his face. "I can't take that, Rourke. Not from you. Not today." He kept his voice even. "You're the accused. Anything you transfer to this office 24 hours before your own trial becomes contaminated evidence. The defense lawyer, if you had one, would tell you the same thing." A pause. "I am genuinely sorry." Rourke studied him for a long moment. There was nothing dishonest in Patton's face, just a man doing a calculation he hadn't chosen. He picked up his hands and walked out into the September morning. The Gulf air hit him, salt and low tide and the particular deadness of water that has been sitting since before sunrise. He kept walking, down Mesquite, out behind the Chandlers, through the narrow alley behind the Water Street shops. The fig tree in Mei Lin's yard was visible from the alley, small, dusty September, pressing the leaves flat. Under it, a patch of ground a shade darker than the soil around it. A man who had carried a box without saying a word. He kept walking until the cellar door of the Castaño stable was under his hand. The smell of the place came up the way it always did. Wet straw, horse sweat, the sweetness of grain gone a little damp. And underneath all of it, the salt off the bay 2 blocks east. The mare heard him. She turned her head and looked. When he sat down on the floor beside her stall, she went back to the hay. He sat. The straw was damp where it pressed against his back. Outside the high slat, the sky was the pale gray of an hour that hasn't decided yet what kind of day it wants to be. Somewhere under the dockboards, the water knocked slow and steady against the pilings, patient, not asking anything of anyone. The mare's jaw moved in the dark, slow circles, straw pulling, settling. He had the diary in his hand. He didn't remember taking it out. He turned it over. Cloth cover, dark with handling, her tight, careful English inside, and beside it in the right-hand margins the columns of characters she had put down so that no one could say she hadn't truly understood what she wrote. 2 scripts, 1 truth. 5 months of midnight under a floorboard. He knew how the morning could go. He could walk into that courtroom with this book and it would all dissolve. Birch's testimony, Fitch's arraignment, the 5 months of carrying a dead man's weight in his chest like something he owed. He had watched lies bigger than these fall apart under the weight of a single page read aloud. He knew exactly how it worked. He could be free by noon. He also knew what happened to Mei Lin after. The paperwork, the pressure, the slow machinery of a county that had already decided years before he arrived that she didn't quite count. The wind came off the port, a smell of brine and old wood and the faint sweetness of the morning tide beginning to move. It found the gap in the stable wall and passed through without stopping. The mare exhaled, long, warm, unbothered. Rourke did not move. 23 years of decisions made on instinct, and now, for the first time, he didn't know which way to point. He sat on the floor of the stable with the diary in his lap and the mare breathing steady in the dark beside him. And outside, somewhere over the bay, the sky was beginning to change at the edges. He had until dawn, and when the light came, he would have to choose himself or the woman who had already chosen him. The light came. It came slow, the way it does in September on the Texas coast. Not a clean line, but a softening of the dark. The sky going from black to deep blue to something closer to gray wool. The mare breathed. Rourke got up from the floor. He brushed the straw from his coat. He put the diary inside his vest, buttoned it, and walked out of the stable into the morning. That was all. The Nueces County Courthouse stood 2 blocks from the water on Mesquite Street, its brick face catching the early light without warmth. By the time Rourke pushed through the tall door, the gallery was already half filled. Corpus Christi was a city that liked to watch. The harbor merchants, the women from the church society, the 2 hotel men who'd been talking about this trial for 3 weeks. Judge Harmon Kloss was on the bench. Roy Birch sat near the back with his hat in his lap. Rourke didn't look at Birch. He walked to the front of the room and spoke before anyone told him to sit. "Your Honor, before this proceeding begins, I request that Mei Lin Yuen be summoned to this court as a material witness." Kloss looked at him over his spectacles. "Miss Yuen is in the custody of the deputy marshal, as I understand it." "Then I'll read her testimony myself." He took the diary from his vest and opened it on the railing. He did not ask again. A pause, the kind that decides things. Kloss leaned back. "You may proceed." Rourke read in a flat, clear voice. The voice of a man who had once read dispatches to illiterate soldiers in the field and understood that delivery was not the point. The point was the words. He read the entry dated the 14th of March, 1881, Edmund Fitch's instructions to Roy Birch, the name Wong, the dock, the hour, and what the messenger would be carrying. The line that instructed Birch to ensure that the laborer falls by Ranger Rourke's hand. He rides the north route on Thursdays. The signature was Birch's, written in the irregular hand of a man dictating to someone else and trusting the transcription. The gallery was quiet before he finished the page. Then it wasn't. The murmuring started at the back and moved forward the way sound moves through a crowd, that is, recalculating. 2 men near the window looked at Edmund Fitch, who was sitting in the 3rd row with his hands clasped and his face arranged for a trial he had expected to watch, not to be inside of. Roy Birch stood up. He was halfway to the side door when Deputy Marshal Cyrus Patton stepped into the aisle without thinking. Pure reflex, the instinct of a man who knows what flight looks like. Birch stopped. He looked at Patton. He looked at the gallery. He looked at Judge Kloss. Then he sat back down in his seat and put his hat on the bench beside him and said, "I didn't want anyone killed." Fitch said the laborer would be running by the time Rourke fired, that it'd be a clean miss. He told me the Ranger would fire high. His voice was steady in the way that voices are when a man has already spent his last card and is reading the hand. It wasn't supposed to end up a death. No one in the room said anything. Kloss looked at Birch for a long moment, then at the diary. Can anyone in this room confirm the authorship of this document? From the 2nd row on the left, a man stood. He was old, 60-some years, narrow-shouldered, with the deliberate posture of a man who had spent decades keeping his head down for good reason. He was Heinrich Braun, and he had kept the books for Edmund Fitch's firm for 14 years. "The handwriting in the margins is Birch's," he said. "I know it because he dictated to my clerk in my office. I heard the words. I chose not to remember them." A pause. "I remember them now." Fitch rose from his seat. He did not get far. 2 men on either side of him, men Klaus had placed quietly before the session, stepped close and settled the matter without a word. The side door opened. Mei Lin came in quietly, the way she came into most rooms, and stood near the back wall without pushing through the crowd. Deputy Patton had sent a man for her the moment Birch began to fold, the calculation of a man who understood now how the current actually ran and where he had been pointed. She stood at the back of the gallery and heard Judge Harmon Kloss set down his pen and look at the man standing at the railing with an open diary and 23 years of good service behind him. "Caleb Rourke," Kloss said, "the court finds you not guilty of the charge of murder in the first degree." Across the room she closed her hand around the edge of the doorframe. Not tight, just steady, the way a person holds on to something solid when the floor shifts under them, even when it shifts the right way. Outside, the Gulf air was doing what it always did at that hour. Salt and low tide and the faint sweetness of the morning catch coming up from the docks 2 blocks south. A messenger found Rourke on the courthouse steps, a young man, slightly out of breath, holding a sealed envelope with the Texas Ranger Company D insignia pressed into the wax. Rourke opened it, read it once. The captain offered reinstatement, full rank, with a note that the record would be formally cleared before the week was out. 13 words at the bottom in the captain's hand. "We would be glad to have you back. The battalion needs men like you." Rourke folded the letter once and handed it back to the messenger, sealed side up. "Tell the captain I'm staying in Corpus Christi a little longer." The messenger waited, in case there was more. There wasn't. He had carried a badge for 23 years. He had earned it before he understood the weight of it and spent the last 12 months learning what it cost to lose it. He did not feel, standing on those courthouse steps with the Gulf at his back, that he had made the wrong trade. The badge was the shape of something. The thing itself, the part that had decided, alone in the dark of a stable with the mare breathing steady and a woman waiting in a cell, that was still in his chest. It had been in his chest the whole time. He walked toward Water Street. The Alphia Terrier May sat between a chandler's and a dry goods store. 3 steps down from the street, the door painted the dark green of something that had weathered several seasons. A fig tree was visible at the far edge of the yard, the late summer leaves pressed flat by the heat. He knocked. She opened the door. He held out the diary. "You should keep this," he said. She looked at it, then at him. "I don't need it anymore." He kept his hand out. "Neither do I." She took it. The afternoon light came through the window behind her, that particular September slant that makes the dust in a room look like it's holding still on purpose. A needle lay on the pincushion beside the work table, the thread still through the eye. The smell of the place was the same as it had always been: beeswax, pressed cloth, and the faint cool of the stone floor. Neither of them said anything else. The ones who go unnoticed are the ones who see everything. The following morning, the mare had Fano fresco in her stall. No one at the Castaño had put it there. The stable hand said he'd found it before sunup. Nobody saw who came in, or when, or which way they'd gone after. Caleb Rourke never went back to the Rangers. Some people in town said he wasted his career, but the woman who had watched the city for 7 years from behind a needle and thread, she thought he found it. If you've ever chosen someone's dignity over your own reward, you know what he found. And if this story found you, stay close. There's another one coming.